The fluorescent lights of Hanuman University Hospital flickered against the November rain of 1986. In room 238, a skeletal figure lay motionless beneath starched white sheets, her once luminous dark eyes now hollow pools of exhaustion. The woman who had graced the covers of Vogue, Cosmopolitan, and Harper's Bazaar, who had commanded $10,000 a day when most models earned $200, was dying alone. At 26, Gia Carangi's body was ravaged by AIDS-related pneumonia, her legendary beauty reduced to lesions and fever. The attending nurse didn't recognize her. How could she? The face that had once stopped traffic in Times Square was now gaunt and weathered, bearing no resemblance to the goddess who had redefined beauty itself. The same hands that had once trembled for heroin now lay still. The same lips that had kissed both men and women with reckless abandon were silent forever. In her final moments, Gia whispered something that the nurse couldn't quite catch. Perhaps a name, perhaps a prayer, perhaps just the sound of air escaping from lungs that had finally given up their fight. The fashion world barely noticed. Vogue didn't run an obituary. Her agency released a 2-line statement buried on page 6 of Women's Wear Daily. But those who knew Gia understood that her death marked more than the end of a troubled life. It was the violent collision between raw humanity and an industry that worshipped perfection while devouring souls. In the hospital's basement morgue, as her body awaited collection, a janitor found something that made him pause. A crumpled Polaroid tucked into her jacket pocket. It showed a young woman with wild hair and defiant eyes laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. On the back, someone had written in fading ink, "Gia, age 17, before the world got hold of her." Was this really how it had to end? Or had the very forces that created fashion's first supermodel also orchestrated her destruction? The questions that surrounded her death were as complex as the woman herself. Some whispered about a mysterious black book that contained the secrets of fashion's elite, a book that supposedly vanished from her apartment before police arrived. Others spoke of powerful enemies who wanted her silenced, of drug debts that had grown too large to ignore, of a young woman who simply knew too much about the wrong people. To understand how the brightest star in the modeling galaxy burned out so catastrophically, we must journey back to where it all began, to a working-class Philadelphia neighborhood where a wild-haired Italian girl first learned that beauty could be both her salvation and her curse. Born on January 29, 1960, in the Fishtown section of Philadelphia, Gia Carangi entered a world already fractured by conflict. Her father, Joseph, ran a small restaurant called Hoagie City with the mechanical precision of a man trying to control chaos. The walls were covered with faded photographs of Italy and plastic plants that gathered dust like abandoned dreams. Her mother, Kathleen, was an Irish beauty whose own aspirations of stardom had withered into suburban disappointment and prescription pills that rattled in secret bathroom cabinets. The Carangi household crackled with tension that could be felt before you even crossed the threshold. Neighbors would later recall the sound of screaming matches that shattered dinner plates. Doors slammed so hard they splintered their frames, and silences so thick they seemed to absorb oxygen from the air. Little Gia absorbed it all with the intensity of a sponge soaking up poison, her dark eyes tracking every movement, every gesture, every unspoken threat that hung in the air like smoke. Even as a toddler, she displayed an unsettling combination of magnetism and volatility that made adults uncomfortable. Neighbors would stop dead in their tracks to stare at the dark-haired child with eyes like black diamonds. But they also whispered about her tantrums, volcanic eruptions of rage that left her parents exhausted and bewildered. At age 5, she would strip naked and run through the neighborhood, laughing maniacally as adults chased her with bathrobes and embarrassed apologies. At 7, she was stealing makeup from Woolworths, applying it with the skill of someone twice her age, transforming herself into a miniature woman while other children played with dolls. The first sign of her future came at age 9, when a local photographer spotted her at the King of Prussia Mall. He approached Kathleen about using Gia for a department store catalog. The photos were never used. The photographer later claimed that Gia was too intense for children's clothing, but Kathleen kept the contact sheets. In them, even at 9 years old, Gia possessed something that transcended mere prettiness. Her gaze was direct, almost challenging, as if she was daring the camera to capture something beyond surface beauty. When Gia was 11, Kathleen made the decision that would echo through her daughter's entire life. She filed for divorce. Joseph Carangi, for all his flaws, had been Gia's anchor in an increasingly unstable world. His sudden absence from the daily routine left a void that would never be filled. The man who had taught her to make perfect cappuccino, who had let her help in the restaurant kitchen, who had been the only person capable of calming her legendary tantrums, was suddenly reduced to weekend visits that grew increasingly sporadic. Gia never forgave her mother for breaking apart their family, and she never forgave her father for not fighting harder to keep it together. In the years that followed, she would use this abandonment as both weapon and shield, hurling it at anyone who tried to get close while simultaneously using it to explain her own inability to trust or commit. Could these early fractures have predicted the earthquake that would eventually level everything Gia touched? The signs were already there. A desperate hunger for attention that could never be satisfied. A complete inability to conform to societal expectations. And a beauty so arresting it seemed almost alien. But perhaps most tellingly, even as a child, Gia seemed to understand instinctively that love was something you had to perform for, not something you simply received. At 14, Gia discovered two things that would define her existence: the Philadelphia gay scene and her own reflection. She began sneaking into Center City clubs where drag queens and hustlers created their own families from society's discarded children. Places like the Key West and the Venture Inn became her real universities, teaching her lessons that no suburban high school ever could. Here, surrounded by glitter and shadows, Gia found her first taste of unconditional acceptance from people who understood what it meant to be different, dangerous, and beautiful all at once. It was in one of these clubs that she met Sandy Linter, a makeup artist 7 years her senior who would become her first real love, her gateway into the fashion world, and ultimately the measuring stick against which all future relationships would fail. Sandy was everything Gia wasn't. Composed, professional, grounded in reality, but she was also drawn to Gia's case like a moth to flame. Their relationship was passionate, toxic, and transformative in ways that neither of them fully understood at the time. Sandy introduced Gia to the mechanics of beauty, how to contour her already perfect cheekbones to create shadows that photographers would kill for, how to make her eyes smolder with just a flick of liner, how to transform her naturally wild hair into something that whispered sophistication while screaming rebellion. But she also introduced her to the currency of attraction, teaching Gia that her looks were power, weapon, and vulnerability all rolled into one dangerous package. Under Sandy's tutelage, Gia learned that beauty was a language with its own grammar and syntax. A tilted head could convey vulnerability or defiance depending on the angle. A parted lip could suggest innocence or experience with the subtlest shift in context. Most importantly, she learned that the camera was not just a recording device. It was a seduction, and she was naturally fluent in its desires. But their relationship was built on an unstable foundation. Sandy was trying to mold Gia into something manageable, while Gia was fundamentally unmoldable. Their fights were legendary among Philadelphia's club scene, screaming matches that could clear a dance floor, followed by passionate reconciliations that were just as public and just as intense. Gia would disappear for days, returning with stories that Sandy didn't want to believe about older men, dangerous drugs, and situations that no teenager should navigate alone. At 17, with her high school education abandoned and her mother's patience exhausted, Gia made a decision that would rocket her toward destiny. She moved to New York City with nothing but a suitcase full of thrift store clothes, a portfolio of Polaroids taken by a friend with a cheap camera, and Sandy's phone number written on a piece of paper that she guarded like a talisman. The year was 1978, and the fashion industry was ripe for revolution. New York hit Gia like a drug that was perfectly calibrated to her nervous system. The city's energy matched her own restless intensity. Its appetite for reinvention mirrored her own shape-shifting nature, and its indifference to conventional morality felt like coming home. Within weeks, she was stalking the corridors of modeling agencies with the confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt her own magnetism, leaving behind a trail of dropped jaws and hastily scribbled phone numbers. Elite model management was the first to see it, that indefinable quality that separated pretty girls from goddesses. Eileen Ford herself, the industry's most feared gatekeeper, took one look at Gia's test shots and knew she was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented. "This one," she allegedly told her husband Jerry, "is going to change everything." The words proved prophetic in ways that Ford couldn't have imagined, but Gia's ascent wasn't smooth or predictable. Her first professional shoots were disasters of epic proportions that somehow resulted in transcendent photographs. She showed up 3 hours late to a Vogue shoot, claiming she had been exploring the city. She arrived at a Harper's Bazaar session visibly high, then proceeded to deliver one of the most striking beauty editorials the magazine had ever published. She argued with photographers, insulted stylists, and once famously told a Vogue editor to "go fuck yourself" when asked to wear a dress she didn't like, then posed in it anyway and made it look like something from a Renaissance painting. The contradictions were maddening and magnetic in equal measure. Richard Avedon, who would later photograph Gia for some of her most iconic images, described working with her as like trying to direct lightning. Francesco Scavullo was more blunt. She was fire and glass at the same time, beautiful enough to burn you, fragile enough to shatter in your hands. What made Gia different wasn't just her beauty. New York was full of beautiful girls. It was her complete inability to pretend she was anyone other than exactly who she was. While other models learned to become blank canvases for other people's visions, Gia remained stubbornly, magnificently herself. She brought her entire biography to every photograph: her parents' divorce, her sexual awakening, her hunger for love, her fear of abandonment. The camera captured all of it, creating images that felt less like fashion photography and more like psychological portraits. Was this natural talent, or was Gia's chaotic lifestyle actually feeding her artistry? The question would haunt everyone who worked with her, because for every tantrum, every missed call time, every drug-fueled meltdown, there was always that moment when the shutter clicked and magic happened. She didn't just model clothes, she inhabited them, transforming fabric into fantasy with nothing more than a glance. A simple sweater became a statement about vulnerability. A cocktail dress transformed into armor against the world's cruelty. A leather jacket suggested both protection and danger, sometimes within the same frame. By 1979, Gia Carangi owned New York in a way that few people ever own anything. Her face launched 1,000 campaigns, her body sold millions of magazines, and her attitude redefined what it meant to be a supermodel. The term itself was still relatively new, but Gia embodied its full potential. She was super in every sense, larger than life, more beautiful than seemed humanly possible, more charismatic than a mere mortal had any right to be. She was Vogue's golden girl, gracing the cover multiple times with images that are still referenced by photographers today. The September 1979 cover, shot by Francesco Scavullo, showed Gia in a simple white shirt. her hair tousled as if she had just gotten out of bed. Her eyes looking directly at the camera with an expression that was simultaneously innocent and knowing. The image sold more copies than any Vogue cover that year, and fashion historians now mark it as the moment when modeling became about more than just selling clothes. It became about selling dreams, fantasies, and the possibility of transformation. Behind the scenes, Gia commanded fees that made hardened agents weep with joy. At her peak, she was earning more in a single day than most Americans made in 6 months. Photographers like Chris von Wangenheim and Albert Watson fought to book her, knowing that Gia could transform even the most mundane product shot into art. Her mere presence on a set elevated everyone's work. Photographers found themselves taking risks they had never considered. Stylists pushed boundaries they had never crossed. Makeup artists discovered new techniques inspired by her bone structure. The famous Armani campaign of 1980 crystallized her power and influence. Shot by Richard Avedon in his stark, minimalist style, it featured Gia wearing nothing but an oversized blazer, her body twisted into an impossible pose that was both elegant and erotic. The shoot took place over 3 days, during which Gia completely reimagined what fashion photography could be. Avedon later said that he had arrived with a specific vision, but Gia had insisted on something more raw, more honest, more dangerous. The resulting images became iconic, not just for their technical brilliance, but for the way Gia's eyes seemed to hold secrets that viewers desperately wanted to know. She wasn't just selling clothes, she was selling desire itself, packaging it in a way that made people want to possess not just the blazer but the attitude, the confidence, the seemingly effortless sexuality that Gia embodied. The campaign ran for 2 years and is still referenced in fashion schools as an example of perfect synergy between photographer, model, and vision. But the real magic happened in the spaces between the planned shots. Avedon's contact sheets from that session, which surfaced years later, revealed dozens of unguarded moments where Gia simply existed in front of the camera. In these images, she was neither performing nor posing. She was simply being, and the camera captured something that felt almost sacred in its honesty. Behind the scenes, however, cracks were already showing in the perfect facade. Gia's drug use, which had started as recreational cocaine at Studio 54, was escalating into something far more dangerous and consuming. Heroin entered her life through a fashion photographer whose name has been carefully scrubbed from official histories, but whose influence on Gia's trajectory was catastrophic. He introduced her to the drug during a particularly intense period when she was working 18-hour days and sleeping 3 hours a night, telling her it would help her relax, help her sleep, help her cope with the pressure. The heroin was like nothing Gia had ever experienced. Unlike cocaine, which amplified her natural intensity, heroin wrapped her in a cocoon of artificial peace. For someone who had spent her entire life feeling everything too intensely, the drug offered blessed numbness. At first she could hide it, shooting up between her toes to avoid track marks, using eye drops to clear the telltale pinpoint pupils, timing her doses carefully so that she was functional during shoots. But addiction has its own timeline, indifferent to fame or fortune or the demands of a modeling career. What started as occasional use became daily use, became hourly use, became the organizing principle around which every other aspect of Gia's life revolved. She began carrying works with her everywhere, hidden in makeup bags, taped under car dashboards, concealed in the false bottom of her purse. The ritual of preparation, injection, and recovery became more important than food, sleep, or human connection. The fashion world noticed but chose willful blindness. Gia was too profitable to lose, too magical to replace, too integral to the industry's bottom line to confront honestly. Magazine editors rationalized her erratic behavior as artistic temperament. After all, wasn't unpredictability part of what made her so compelling? Photographers convinced themselves that her increasing gauntness was just the natural evolution of high fashion's aesthetic. Hadn't Twiggy been even thinner? Everyone wanted to believe that someone so beautiful, so successful, so seemingly invincible couldn't possibly be destroying herself in real time. The denial ran deep and involved some of the biggest names in fashion. Anna Wintour, then a rising editor, later admitted that she had suspected Gia's drug use but felt it wasn't her place to intervene. Richard Avedon confessed years later that he had noticed track marks during a 1981 shoot, but convinced himself they were scratches from Gia's cat. Even Eileen Ford, who prided herself on protecting her models, claimed she had no idea how serious Gia's problem had become until it was too late to help. But behind all that glamour, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The answer lay in Gia's increasing desperation for authentic connection in a world that valued her only for her surface. Despite being surrounded by people who wanted something from her, agents who wanted their commissions, photographers who wanted their shots, lovers who wanted to bask in her reflected glory, Gia felt more isolated than ever. She began showing up to shoots with track marks visible, not because she'd given up hiding them, but because part of her wanted someone to notice, someone to care enough to intervene. The isolation was particularly acute in her romantic life. After Sandy Linter, Gia struggled to find relationships that weren't contaminated by her fame or her addiction. She had a series of affairs with both men and women, each one following a similar pattern: intense attraction, passionate connection, gradual realization that Gia was more committed to heroin than to any human being, and inevitable abandonment. Each failed relationship reinforced her belief that she was fundamentally unlovable, that her beauty was all she had to offer, that once people saw past the surface, they would inevitably run away. One particularly painful relationship was with a young actor named Michael, whose last name Gia never shared with anyone. They met at a party in 1981, and for a brief period, Gia seemed to find some stability. Michael didn't work in fashion, didn't want anything from her career, and seemed genuinely interested in the person behind the perfect cheekbones. But when he discovered her drug use and issued an ultimatum, rehab or goodbye, Gia chose goodbye. Years later, she would describe this as the moment she realized that heroin had become more important to her than love, happiness, or even survival. The beginning of the end came in 1982, during what should have been the pinnacle of her career. Gia was booked for a major Versace campaign in the Bahamas, a dream assignment that would have cemented her status as fashion's undisputed queen and earned her enough money to be financially secure for years. The concept was simple but elegant. Gia in flowing white fabrics against the crystal blue waters of Nassau, embodying both earthly sensuality and ethereal beauty. Instead, she disappeared for 3 days. The production team, which included dozens of crew members who had flown in specifically for the shoot, waited in expensive hotels while their star model was missing in action. She was eventually found in a crack house in Newark, barely conscious and missing 2 front teeth, having traded her plane ticket money for drugs and hitchhiked back to the mainland in search of a better high. The client sued for breach of contract. Elite model management quietly began distancing themselves from their once golden shut. Most devastatingly, the fashion press, which had once treated Gia as untouchable, began running blind items about her behavior. The same magazines that had built her up now participated in tearing her down, describing her as unreliable and unprofessional and past her prime at the age of 22. But the real devastation wasn't professional. It was personal. Sandy Linter, who had been Gia's on and off partner for years, finally gave up. In a tearful confrontation outside Gia's East Village apartment, Sandy delivered an ultimatum that would haunt both of them forever. Choose the drugs or choose me. The conversation lasted 3 hours, with Sandy begging, pleading, and finally threatening. Gia, in a moment of devastating honesty, told Sandy that she wished she could choose her, but that heroin was the only thing that made her feel normal, the only thing that quieted the chaos in her head, the only relationship she had that never disappointed her. Sandy left that night and never spoke to Gia again, despite numerous attempts by mutual friends to reconcile them. Years later, Sandy would say that walking away from Gia was both the hardest and the smartest decision she ever made. "I loved her," Sandy confessed in a rare interview, "but I couldn't save her. No one could save her except herself, and she wasn't ready to be saved." The fashion industry, which had once celebrated Gia's rebellious spirit as refreshing authenticity, now found her unpredictability unacceptable and her beauty insufficient to compensate for her unreliability. Bookings dried up with stunning speed. Magazine editors stopped returning calls from her agency. The same photographers who had once fought to work with her now whispered warnings to each other. "Don't book Gia Carangi. She's unreliable. She's lost it. She's not worth the risk." The fall from grace was made more brutal by its swiftness. In January 1982, Gia had been Vogue's most requested model. By December of the same year, she couldn't book a catalog shoot. The industry that had created her had also perfected the art of erasure, and Gia found herself not just unemployed but unemployable, persona non grata in the world that had once worshipped her. Did this tragic turn of events mark her inevitable downfall? Or was it simply the tipping point of problems that had been festering since childhood? The truth was probably both. Gia's addiction wasn't just about drugs. It was about a fundamental inability to exist in her own skin without chemical assistance. The same sensitivity that made her such a compelling model, her ability to access and project deep emotion, also made her exquisitely vulnerable to pain. And pain in Gia's life was abundant and multifaceted. The psychological profile that emerged from this period painted a picture of someone who had never learned healthy coping mechanisms. Gia's childhood had taught her that love was conditional, that safety was temporary, and that the only constant in life was change. These lessons, while tragic, had actually served her well in the modeling world, where adaptability and emotional availability were valuable commodities. But they left her completely unprepared for managing success, handling rejection, or building lasting relationships. Dr. Susan Miller, a psychiatrist who worked with several high-profile models during this era, later wrote about the unique pressures faced by young women in fashion. "These girls are essentially paid to be perfect," Miller observed, "but perfection is unattainable and unsustainable. The ones who succeed are often the ones who are most damaged, because they're willing to sacrifice everything, including their own well-being, for the image." The fashion world's rejection sent Gia into a spiral that would have been fatal even without the heroin. She began selling her designer clothes to pay for drugs, trading Halston gowns and Versace jackets for $20 bags of heroin. She pawned jewelry that had been gifts from photographers and lovers, turning memories into drug money. The apartment that had once been featured in Architectural Digest became a crash pad for other addicts, its white walls stained with smoke and desperation. Most heartbreaking of all, she began trading sexual favors for fixes. The girl who had once commanded $10,000 a day was turning tricks in the Port Authority bathroom for enough money to get well. The transformation was so complete, so devastating, that former colleagues who ran into her on the street often failed to recognize the skeletal figure as the goddess they had once worshipped. Francesco Scavullo encountered Gia outside his studio in late 1983 and later described the meeting as like seeing a ghost of someone you loved. She was thin to the point of emaciation, her legendary hair lank and unwashed, her skin scarred from injection sites and street fights. But most disturbing were her eyes, the same eyes that had once held such promise, such defiance, such life, now vacant and desperate. "She asked me for money," Scavullo recalled, and I gave it to her knowing exactly what she would do with it. I told myself I was helping her, but really I was just making it easier for her to kill herself slowly. By 1983, Gia's descent had reached what seemed like rock bottom, though she would discover in the months that followed that there was always further to fall. Living in a series of increasingly squalid apartments surrounded by other addicts who saw her only as a source of money or connection, she had become a ghost haunting her own life. The mirror that had once been her best friend now reflected a stranger, hollow-cheeked, hollow-eyed, hollowed out from the inside. Yet even in this darkness, flickers of the old Gia occasionally surfaced like glimpses of sunlight through storm clouds. She would call former lovers at 3 in the morning, not to ask for money, but to reminisce about better times, to apologize for things she couldn't quite name, to hear a familiar voice tell her that she had once been loved. She wrote letters to her mother filled with apologies and promises that both women knew would never be kept. Most tellingly, she still carried a portfolio of her best photographs, showing them to anyone who would look, as if she could will herself back into that golden world through sheer force of memory. The portfolio became a kind of talisman, proof that the glory days had actually happened and weren't just hallucinations brought on by drug withdrawal. In one particularly heartbreaking incident, witnesses reported seeing Gia in Washington Square Park, showing her Vogue covers to homeless people and tourists, asking if they remembered her, if they recognized the woman in the photographs. When someone finally said yes, she burst into tears. Whether from joy or grief, no one could tell. In her more lucid moments, Gia understood with devastating clarity that her addiction had become her identity. She once told a fellow addict, "I don't want to be remembered as a model. I want to be remembered as someone who tried to live." But trying to live and actually living are two different things, and the gap between them was filled with heroin and heartbreak and the accumulated weight of 1,000 small surrenders. The awareness made her situation even more tragic. Unlike addicts who maintain delusions about their ability to control their usage, Gia possessed an almost clinical understanding of her own deterioration. She could describe in detail how heroin had rewired her brain, how it had become more important than food or shelter or human connection. This knowledge didn't help her quit. If anything, it made her situation feel more hopeless. But it gave her a kind of dignity in decline, a refusal to pretend that her choices were anything other than what they were. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Gia, the answer seemed to be no, though not for lack of trying. She made several attempts at rehabilitation, checking into facilities in Pennsylvania and New York, going through the motions of recovery while her heart remained committed to self-destruction. Each attempt followed the same pattern: initial enthusiasm, genuine effort to engage with treatment, gradual realization that sobriety meant facing the emptiness that drugs had been masking, and inevitable relapse. The emptiness was the real enemy, not the heroin itself. Drugs were just the medicine Gia used to treat an existential wound that had been festering since childhood. Without chemical assistance, she was left alone with thoughts and feelings that seemed too large for any human being to contain. The same emotional intensity that had made her such a compelling model became unbearable when experienced directly, without the buffer of intoxication. Dr. Robert Millman, an addiction specialist who treated several models during the 1980s, later wrote about the unique challenges faced by people whose identities were built around external validation. When your entire sense of self depends on other people's approval, Millman observed, sobriety can feel like a kind of death. These individuals literally don't know who they are without the performance, without the audience, without the external confirmation of their worth. The final years of Gia's life were a masterclass in degradation, but also in the stubborn persistence of human dignity in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. The last known professional photograph of her was taken in 1985 by photographer Stephen Meisel, who later became one of fashion's most celebrated image makers. The shoot was intended as a comeback attempt, a chance for Gia to prove that she could still deliver the magic that had once made her unstoppable. The resulting images were haunting in their beauty and their sadness. Gia's face, though marked by years of hard living, still possessed traces of her otherworldly beauty. But something fundamental had changed in her relationship with the camera. Where once she had commanded the lens, now she seemed to be pleading with it, asking it to remember her as she had been, rather than documenting who she had become. Michel never published the photographs, and they remain locked in his archive to this day. In rare interviews, he has described the shoot as one of the most heartbreaking experiences of my career. He reportedly told Gia's agent afterward that while the pictures were technically beautiful, they were too sad to ever see public use. She was trying so hard to be the old Gia, Michel recalled, but the old Gia was gone and we were all just pretending she might come back. The last candid photograph of Gia was taken by a friend in 1985, outside a methadone clinic in Philadelphia. In it, she sits on a street corner, her once lustrous hair lank and dirty, her legendary cheekbones hidden beneath drug-induced bloat. She's wearing clothes that appear to be donated, a too large sweater and jeans that don't fit properly. But her eyes, those dark, dangerous eyes that had launched 1,000 fantasies, still held traces of the fire that had once burned so bright, though now it flickered like a candle in a hurricane. She made half-hearted attempts to reconnect with family during this period, showing up at her mother's house in the middle of the night, begging for help that Kathleen no longer knew how to provide. These visits followed a predictable pattern. Gia would arrive sober and apologetic, full of plans for getting clean and rebuilding her life. Kathleen would let her in, feed her, let her sleep in her childhood bedroom surrounded by photographs from her modeling days. But within hours or days, Gia would disappear again, taking whatever money or valuables she could find, leaving behind only promises and the lingering scent of desperation. Kathleen later described these visits as torture disguised as hope. She wanted to help her daughter but had learned through bitter experience that Gia was only capable of receiving help on her own terms, which meant not receiving it at all. The mother who had once driven her daughter to modeling agencies now found herself hiding her purse when Gia came to visit, counting the spoons after she left, double-checking the locks on doors and windows. She tried to rekindle relationships with former lovers, but the person who came crawling back bore little resemblance to the woman they had once loved. Sandy Linter received dozens of letters from Gia during this period, each one more desperate than the last. In them, Gia alternately begged for reconciliation, blamed Sandy for abandoning her, and promised to get clean if only Sandy would take her back. Sandy kept every letter but never responded, understanding that any communication would only prolong both of their suffering. Most painfully, Gia attempted several times to restart her modeling career, showing up at agencies with outdated composite cards and dreams that had curdled into delusion. She would sit in waiting rooms for hours, her presence making everyone uncomfortable, insisting that she was ready to work again, that she had learned from her mistakes, that she could be the old Gia if only someone would give her a chance. These attempts were met with a combination of pity and fear. Former colleagues who had once competed for her attention now crossed the street to avoid encountering her. Photographers who had built their careers on her beauty refused to take her calls. The same magazines that had featured her on their covers now acted as if she had never existed, a collective amnesia that was both protective and cruel. The fashion industry that had once worshipped her now treated her like a cautionary tale, wheeling her out at industry events as an example of what happened when models didn't follow the rules. But the lesson was never framed in terms of the industry's responsibility to protect its talent. It was always about individual failure, personal weakness, the inability to handle success with appropriate grace and professionalism. In late 1985, Gia contracted HIV through shared needles, a death sentence in an era when AIDS was still shrouded in fear and ignorance. The diagnosis should have been a wake-up call. But by then, her addiction was too powerful, her despair too complete, her sense of future too obliterated to motivate any meaningful change. She continued using drugs even as her immune system collapsed, as if she had decided that dying slowly was preferable to living with the wreckage of her choices. The HIV diagnosis also marked the beginning of a new kind of isolation. In 1985, AIDS was still widely misunderstood, and Gia found that even the community of addicts who had been her last refuge began to shun her. Shooting galleries refused her entry. Former friends stopped sharing needles with her. The disease that would eventually kill her also stripped away her final human connections, leaving her more alone than she had ever been. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation? Perhaps they were both. In choosing to numb herself against the pain of her own existence, Gia was both giving up and protecting whatever remained of her core self from further damage. Death, in her case, might have been the only escape from a prison that had become unbearable. The progression of her illness was swift and merciless. The immune system that had once protected her through years of drug abuse finally collapsed under the weight of AIDS. She developed pneumonia repeatedly, each bout leaving her weaker than the last. Her legendary beauty, which had survived heroin addiction and years of malnutrition, finally succumbed to the ravages of opportunistic infections and the side effects of early AIDS treatments. On November 18, 1986, Gia Carangi died alone in a Philadelphia hospital, her body finally succumbing to the AIDS-related pneumonia that had been consuming her for months. She was 26 years old, the same age at which Marilyn Monroe had filmed The 7-Year Itch, at which Grace Kelly had won her Oscar, at which countless other women were just beginning to understand their own power and potential. The funeral was small, attended mostly by family members who had spent years watching helplessly as their daughter, sister, cousin destroyed herself in slow motion. Joseph Carangi, the father who had been largely absent during Gia's adult life, wept openly at the graveside. Kathleen, the mother who had borne the brunt of Gia's anger and manipulation, stood dry-eyed and silent, her grief too deep for tears. Sandy Linter came to the funeral but sat in the back, unwilling to claim a place among the mourners despite having loved Gia longer and more deeply than almost anyone. She later described the service as surreal, noting that the person being eulogized bore little resemblance to the vibrant, impossible woman she had known. They talked about her struggles with addiction, Sandy recalled, but they didn't talk about her brilliance, her passion, her incredible capacity for love. It was like they were burying a cautionary tale instead of a human being. The fashion industry's response was telling in its silence. No major magazine ran an obituary. Her former agency released a perfunctory statement that could have been written about any deceased employee. The photographers who had built their reputations on her beauty were notably absent from any public tributes. It was as if the industry wanted to erase her entirely, to pretend that her talent had never existed rather than confront their own complicity in her destruction. But erasure proved impossible. In death, Gia became something she had never been in life, a symbol. Her story began circulating in whispered conversations among models who saw their own vulnerability reflected in her fate. Fashion insiders started questioning, quietly at first, whether an industry that demanded physical perfection while offering emotional emptiness might be fundamentally toxic to the young women it claimed to celebrate. The conspiracy theories started almost immediately and persist to this day. Some claimed that Gia had been murdered by drug dealers she owed money to, pointing to the suspicious timing of her death, just before a major drug debt was due. Others suggested that powerful forces in the fashion industry had orchestrated her downfall to make an example of anyone who threatened their control, noting how quickly and completely she had been blacklisted. The most persistent rumor involved a supposed black book that Gia had kept, documenting the drug use and sexual exploits of major figures in fashion and entertainment. According to this theory, the book contained enough explosive information to destroy careers and bring down entire agencies. Witnesses claimed that Gia had been seen with such a book in the weeks before her death, but it allegedly disappeared from her apartment before police arrived to process the scene. While no concrete evidence has ever emerged to support these theories, they reflect a deeper truth about the fashion industry's treatment of its talent. Whether or not Gia was literally murdered, she was certainly killed by a system that valued her only for what she could produce and discarded her the moment she became inconvenient. Was her death as straightforward as reported, or were more powerful hidden forces involved? The truth is probably simpler and more tragic than any conspiracy theory. Gia Carangi was killed by an industry that commodified beauty while destroying the people who possessed it. She was a casualty of a system that demanded perfection while offering no tools for achieving it, that promised love while delivering only exploitation. The official cause of death was listed as AIDS-related pneumonia, but the real cause was more complex, a lethal combination of addiction, abandonment, and an industry that had never learned to value human life over profit margins. Gia died because she lived in a world that treated women's bodies as products and their souls as expendable, a world that created impossible standards and then punished those who failed to meet them. Yet her influence extends far beyond her tragic end, reaching across decades to continue shaping how we think about beauty, fame, and the price of perfection. The 1998 HBO biopic Gia, starring Angelina Jolie, introduced her story to a new generation and cemented her status as fashion's most tragic icon. Jolie's portrayal, while necessarily compressed and dramatized, captured something essential about Gia's character: her magnetic charisma, her self-destructive tendencies, and her desperate hunger for authentic love. The film sparked a renaissance of interest in Gia's story, leading to books, documentaries, and academic studies about her life and career. Fashion historians began to reassess her contributions to the industry, recognizing her not just as a cautionary tale but as a genuine innovator who had helped redefine what modeling could be. Her photographs, which had been largely forgotten in the immediate aftermath of her death, were rediscovered and celebrated for their artistic merit. Models like Kate Moss and Cindy Crawford have cited Gia as an influence, not just for her beauty but for her refusal to conform to industry expectations. Moss, in particular, has spoken about how Gia's authenticity inspired her own approach to modeling, encouraging her to bring her full personality to every shoot rather than trying to disappear into the clothes. Her legacy also extends into the realm of social activism. Gia was one of the first public figures to die of AIDS, and her death helped humanize a disease that was still widely stigmatized. AIDS activists have used her story to advocate for better treatment and support for people with HIV, arguing that her death might have been preventable if society had responded to the epidemic with compassion rather than fear. Perhaps most importantly, Gia's story forced the fashion industry to confront its own darkness, though progress has been slow and incomplete. Her death became a catalyst for conversations about drug abuse, mental health, and the responsibility that agencies have for their models' well-being. While these conversations haven't solved all the industry's problems, they have created space for change and reform. The dialogue she sparked continues to this day, as new generations of models face many of the same pressures that destroyed Gia. Social media has created new forms of scrutiny and comparison, while the industry's appetite for young, beautiful, and ultimately disposable women remains largely unchanged. But Gia's story serves as a reminder that behind every perfect image lies a human being struggling with very real pain, and that our collective worship of beauty means nothing if we abandon the beautiful when they need us most. In the decades since her death, Gia has become a kind of patron saint for anyone who has felt too sensitive for the world they inhabit, too intense for the roles they're expected to play, too authentic for an industry built on artifice. Her photographs continue to inspire photographers and models, proving that great art can transcend the circumstances of its creation. More than 30 years after her death, her images still possess the power to stop viewers in their tracks, to make them feel something beyond mere aesthetic appreciation. The Philadelphia cemetery where Gia is buried has become an unofficial pilgrimage site, visited by fashion students, photographers, and people who see their own struggles reflected in her story. Visitors leave flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes expressing gratitude for her contributions to fashion and sympathy for her suffering. The gravestone, which simply reads Gia Marie Carangi 1960 to 1986, has become weathered by time and touch, a physical reminder that some stories continue to resonate long after their endings. In the end, Gia Marie Carangi remains exactly what she always was: fire and glass, beauty and destruction, talent and tragedy wrapped into one impossible package. She was fashion's first supermodel and its first cautionary tale, a reminder that in an industry that sells dreams, the dreamers themselves often pay the ultimate price. Her life was brief but blazing, a comet that streaked across the fashion sky before burning out in spectacular fashion. What hidden truths about fame, beauty, and the human cost of perfection might her story still hold for us today? Perhaps the most important lesson is that true beauty, the kind that matters, the kind that lasts, cannot be reduced to surface appearances or market value. Gia's enduring influence comes not from her ability to sell products or embody fantasies, but from her refusal to pretend that perfection was possible, or that success could heal the wounds of childhood, or that fame could substitute for love. Her story reminds us that behind every glossy magazine cover, every perfectly lit photograph, every impossible standard of beauty, there are real people with real pain, real dreams, and real limitations. In a culture that increasingly values image over substance, Gia's life and death serve as a powerful reminder that the people we idolize are human beings first, symbols second, and that our worship means nothing if it comes at the cost of their humanity. The questions that surrounded her death may never be fully answered, but the questions raised by her life remain as relevant as ever. How do we celebrate beauty without destroying the beautiful? How do we create art without consuming the artists? How do we build industries that honor human dignity while pursuing profit? These are the real mysteries that Gia Carangi left behind, not the circumstances of her death, but the challenge of learning to live with both beauty and humanity intact.